morning, everybody, and welcome to the Law&Crime Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program where we bring you the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Okay, finances can get a bit complicated, so let's try to break it down right now about what's actually happening and what we should take from this. Joining me is a familiar face here on the network, one of our hosts, the juvenile judge and trial attorney, Judge Ashley Willcott is with us. Good morning, Judge Ashley. I'm glad you're here to break all this down. I want to get right into it. These financial dealings, do you view it as him up to some shady business, doing something wrong, stealing from the company, or was he just going about the regular course of business even though his best friend and his family disappeared?
Well, good morning, Jesse. So that's the argument to be made. It sounds shady. It sounds suspect because certainly you just heard clear testimony that he did cash checks, that they were checks that were not on the same date reflected in QuickBooks. But you know, Jesse, a lot of small businesses, this is how it works. And you're writing a check for this and a check for that, and you're owed for this. And so it's not that atypical. The other piece of the testimony I think is crucial is this detective said, I cannot tell you who was behind the computer printing these checks. We have to assume, quite frankly, I think the jury does, that it was actually Charles Merritt.
Okay, even if we take it as true, and it seems like a pretty strong case, it's him and not his cat using the computer. The question that I have, even if we accept this, can a jury convict him based upon taking money from Joseph McStay or doing something shady? I mean, isn't that the danger? Because they might not have a strong case forensic-wise, but they maybe have a strong motive.
Well, it doesn't matter. You know, motive's important. We want to know what happened as people. The jury wants to know the motive. Why did they do it? But the motive is not an element of the crime. So the motive really doesn't matter in terms of, is there enough evidence to convict him for the crime and killing all four of these family members? Motive helps, but that does not in and of itself prove that the crime was committed by this defendant.
But a motive tells a good story, right? And the thing here is, why would a person kill his best friend, or seemingly his best friend, and his whole family? The jury needs to stick to something, though.
Absolutely. And in this case, it's important to show some kind of motive because I think you might agree with me that the evidence, the forensic evidence that you referenced, is circumstantial at best in this case, Jesse. There are a lot of holes I think the defense could poke. So the prosecution wants a motive to make it a stronger case for the jury.
Absolutely. And look, what we're going to be talking about today, when we go back live at 12:30, is we're going to see more of the defense's case where they're poking holes at what the prosecution has presented so far. And we're going to talk about that. I want to get more into what we know, what has been shown, and we have a better understanding. And that's what Judge Ashley and I are going to do. We're going to break it down so that when 12:30 hits, we are as ready as possible and we know what to expect in a case that I have to tell you has been going on for a while, this trial. I mean, it started back in January with opening statements. It started, it stopped. I'm wondering what it's like to be on that jury. It's probably a marathon for them, but we have a lot more to cover. It's interesting looking at testimony from so long ago. Judge Ashley, you know, this trial has been going on since January. How do you keep a jury involved? If you're both the prosecution and the defense, how do you keep them mentally there for so long?
Good luck. As you well know, we've had lots of breaks in this trial for lots of different reasons. It's very tough to do. It presents a challenge for both the prosecution and the defense. What they're going to have to do, Jesse, is they're really going to have strong closing arguments, in my opinion, that reminds the jury of all the evidence they've presented, because these jurors have had a lot of downtime and have forgotten potentially a lot of the evidence that they've seen and heard.
I can tell you one thing, during the prosecution's case, I would be surprised if they didn't include or mention what we're seeing here with the testimony of Detective Dan Hankey, this suspicious activity on the part of Charles Merritt. So let's continue on with his testimony and we'll see how it fits in the overall story. Okay, Judge, let me ask you this. So we heard a flavor of kind of the defense poking holes in this, and you hear them criticizing the investigation. They've been very clear that they feel investigators had a narrow focus strictly on Charles Merritt and that this investigation was not thorough. Do you think there's any weight to that argument?
Well, I think they just made a solid point to support that argument. And here's why. You just heard them say, why didn't it all analyze the phone records? But the defense made clear at the times that checks were being written or shortly thereafter, The defendant was actually speaking by phone to the victim, according to phone records, Joseph McStay, which means, Jesse, they might have been talking about those very checks, the very money, and he may have had permission to do it. So I think already they've shown, look, law enforcement did not look at the whole picture. They looked at specific pieces.
Well, why do you think they ultimately arrested him? Do you think they would have arrested him if they never found the remains? I mean, there was a little bit tying him to the grave site, but not a ton.
No, I don't think they would have arrested him if they hadn't found the remains. Once they found those bodies and were able to look at the evidence with that piece as well, that's when they chose to arrest him and charge him with these crimes.
But the idea of, his tire tracks at the gravesite may match his truck. His cell phone pinged in near the area, maybe. We're not sure if he was on his way to visit his sister or not. Is this enough? Is this enough? I mean, what else? And then also his DNA was found in their car that was parked near the Mexican border, but it wasn't a lot of DNA. It could have been just if he had a contact with Joseph McStay, that DNA might have then been transferred into the car. That's the way that I understand it. Is this enough?
Well, I don't think any one of those things is enough. Again, circumstantial, put all those things together along with the motive that the prosecution is arguing it was because of the money that he took out of the company. Is that enough is the question for the jury. In this case, I don't think it is. I think that the defense has done and is doing, and will continue to watch that, a good job really saying, look, there's reasonable doubt because there were other pieces of DNA found at the crime where the bodies were found that don't belong to the defendant, and yet the law enforcement doesn't know who it belongs to. There's not evidence of a bloody slaughter. My words, nobody else's, but we know this was a brutal, heinous crime of 4 individuals. Right. At the house. So is it enough? I don't think so, but we'll see what the jury thinks.
Well, you mentioned the defense. We had an update yesterday in the courtroom with the testimony of Randolph Beasley, who's a forensic consultant that kind of put a wrench in the prosecution's theory, and we're going to talk about it right after this. Stay tuned. All right, Judge, I mean, this witness is huge for the defense. He's saying the way that this family was killed, all this blood, I would have seen it here, but there's nothing here. I mean, this is a big point.
This is a huge point because the prosecution tied themselves into their argument that the murders occurred in the house. But I'm also going to say this. This expert, Jesse, all he did was provide evidence for the jury to consider that supports a common sense notion. And that is, if the murders had really occurred in this home, 4 individuals brutally murdered, there would have been blood. Even if cleaned up, it would have been found, it would have been more obvious. And in addition to that, I would submit common sense. There might have been signs of a struggle. 4 individuals killed by 1 person, there would have been some type of struggle, most likely. So I think it's great evidence for the defense. But again, it supports a common sense notion that they didn't get murdered in the house.
All right. Well, I want you to think about this. We're going to play more of his testimony, but I want you to think about this. The idea that if they can establish that the killings did not happen in the house, does the prosecution automatically lose their case? Let's think about that. We listened to the defense poking holes in the idea that the family was killed in the house. Ashley, my question to you is, how important is that theory? How important is it for the prosecution to establish that the killings happened in the house? If they can't convince a jury of that, do they automatically lose their case?
It's very important. They could, because venue is one of the elements they have to prove. Venue is where did the crime occur? And they're saying it occurred in the county in which the home is located because it occurred in that home. Jesse, if they can't prove that, then they may not have proven one of the elements of the crime, which is where did the crime occur? Are we even in the right are we in the right court? Do we need to be trying this in a different county? So yes, if they cannot prove venue is proper in that county, then they can't prove the elements of the crime.
That's a really good point. I think you're the first person to mention that. I haven't even thought about that. The question is, just from a practical point of view, if venue wasn't the issue, is it possible that Charles Merritt could have gotten these 4 people to the desert and killed them there?
Absolutely. And I think that, to me, that's a better common sense explanation, because I don't think it makes good common sense it occurred in the house, especially with the testimony yesterday. And, he knew this family. There's no reason to believe that perhaps they didn't voluntarily go somewhere with him or get in their car to meet him somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And we have more to break down with this case. This is just a snippet. So I don't know, Ashley, out of everything the defense has argued, they make a pretty good point that there's serious doubt on this killing happening in the house. But then you tell me, how is it possible that he could have killed this family of 4 somewhere else, had them secreted, in the desert? It appears that Joseph McStay was in a different state than the rest of the family. How did this happen? What would be another theory?
Well, let me go back to that theory first. Maybe it did happen in the house, and perhaps he did clean up any evidence of the crime, even though it was a brutal murder. And perhaps the investigators, even though they did take pictures the defense referenced, didn't capture the evidence that was really in the house. That's number one theory. Number 2 theory of the case, think about it. Their car was found by the Mexican border, right? Their bodies were buried in the desert. So there you have 2 other places there's evidence of the family. Perhaps it occurred in one of those places. Or there's also the theory, Jesse, that we really don't know where they were murdered, but it was neither of those 2 places. It could have been in a third location. Maybe it was in somebody else's car, but this defendant was involved. That's the problem. We really don't know.
And that I don't know could be reasonable doubt. That's the thing. The fact that we are really left with so many questions, I don't know. If you're sitting on that jury, it might not be enough to ultimately convict Charles Merritt, but we have a lot more of a trial to go through. The defense is still putting on their case. We'll have to wait and see if the prosecution puts on any rebuttal witnesses, and then, as Judge Ashley said earlier, we'd be waiting for those closing arguments where they tie in everything from these past several months, and that's going to be quite a job since this trial has been going on since January.